In 2011, the U.S. Public Health Service issued a new set of regulations covering financial conflicts of interest in research. And those regulations go into effect this August the 24th, 2012. The purpose of this presentation is to describe those new regulations, as well as the University of Maryland's policies and procedures for implementing those regulations, and your responsibility as an investigator under those regulations. Let's start by looking at who needs to receive this training. The regulations say that all individuals involved in a U.S. public health service, that would include the NIH, sponsored research grants and contracts that have an issue date on or after August 24th, 2012, must receive the training. By individuals, we mean all investigators, and that is everyone responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of the research sponsored by the Public Health Service. This would include principal investigators, project directors, co-PIs and co-PDs, co-investigators, senior and key personnel, all persons paid from the grant or contract, and all persons working directly on the research, even if they are not paid. At this early stage in the implementation of the regulations, we're interpreting them fairly broadly. If it turns out that in the future we can revise policies to exclude some folks who do not need to follow the regulations, we will consider doing so. Now, the regulations themselves are applied to the same cohort of people, and they are applicable as follows. They're applicable to all public health service supported research, to all individuals involved in that research, and to all grants or contracts with an issue date on or after August 24th, 2012. The agencies that fall within the U.S. Public Health Service include the largest, of course, for our institution, which is the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, as well as these other agencies. As a PHS-funded investigator, there is a notice of grant award that comes from the agency to the university, and that notice of grant award has on it an issue date, and it's that issue date that determines the research that must fall within these regulations. The curriculum that's required is the curriculum you're receiving today. Training in what the regulations call for, training in the university's policies and procedures for implementing those regulations, and your responsibilities as an investigator. So what do the new regulations require? Let's start with an overview of the required elements. First, the investigator must be trained, and they must be trained before research begins and every 4 years thereafter. This presentation constitutes investigator training. Second, the investigator will disclose their significant financial interests to the university. I'll be describing what's included in significant financial interests in a bit. Third, the university determines whether or not any of those significant financial interests that you've disclosed constitute financial conflicts of interest with your PHS-sponsored research. If they do, that is, if there is a financial conflict of interest, then a management plan will be developed. And finally, for those financial conflicts of interest, the university reports those financial conflicts of interest to the Public Health Service agency. And that is done before funds are expended by the university. Notice that some of these requirements are the responsibility of the investigator. Training, disclosure of the significant financial interests. The university is responsible for determining whether or not there's a financial conflict of interest. We work together to develop a management plan, and the university takes responsibility for reporting the financial conflicts of interest. Let's take a look at each of these steps in a little more detail, starting with investigator training. This must occur prior to beginning the PHS-sponsored research, if it falls under these regulations, every 4 years thereafter, and it must be repeated in certain cases of noncompliance. I'll talk about those a little bit later as well. The training includes training in the regulations, training in our policy, and in your responsibilities as an investigator. Investigators must disclose all of their significant financial interests, and that means any financial interests that are related to your institutional responsibilities, regardless of the significant financial interests relationship to your PHS-sponsored research. And by related to your institutional responsibilities, we mean financial interests in any entity. There are some exceptions to this, such as federal agencies, state, local governments, higher education institutions, and so forth, that fall within any area of the university's mission. And that would include research, teaching, and service, including clinical service. These financial interests would be your financial interests, but they would also be financial interests of your spouse and any dependent children. Those would all need to be disclosed as significant financial interests. And on this annual reporting and reporting when you submit a research proposal, we need a yes, I have significant financial interests and here they are, or we need you to say, no, I have no significant financial interests, and you attest to that fact. We need a record of your response one way or another. One example of a financial interest would involve payments, remuneration, or equity, that is stock, in one of these entities. And the entity could be publicly traded or non-publicly traded. It's essentially any outside entity that you have payments from or own in part or in whole. And again, there are some exceptions for this, and those exceptions will be made clear in the university's policy. Notice that there's no dollar amount here. As you may know, the current NIH conflict of interest regulations specify a $10,000 threshold at or under which reporting of those financial interests is not necessary. The new regulations, the ones that go into effect this August, lowered that threshold to $5,000. However, the regulations also say that if your institution, the university, recognizes a lower threshold or a different threshold, a lower threshold, that lower threshold is the one that must be utilized within our policy. As a state of Maryland institution, we have no lower threshold. Therefore, any payments and stock, for example, of any value must be reported as a significant financial interest under these regulations. Intellectual property income, that would be royalties, licensing fees, and so on, except those that are received through the university as a result of some sort of licensing arrangement. Those are reportable as significant financial interests. And finally, any travel that is either paid for by an outside entity on your behalf or that you pay for and are then reimbursed by that outside agency is reportable as a significant, disclosable as a significant financial interest. There are some exceptions to the travel requirement for example, some not-for-profit educational and research institutions, governmental entities, and so on. And those exceptions will also be made clear in our institutional policy. We will talk a little bit later about how investigators will disclose these significant financial interests to the university. The next step is that the university determines the financial conflict of interest. And by university, in this case, we mean our office, the Research Integrity Office. We will take a look at your significant financial interest. We will take a look at your PHS-sponsored research, and in consultation with you and your department chair, make a determination about financial conflict of interest. And we'll do this by looking at the following. Is your significant financial interest that you have disclosed related to your PHS-sponsored research? And by related, we mean, could your financial interest be affected by the outcome of your research? Or could the entity that you have the significant financial interest in, could that entity's interests be affected by your research? A second question we will ask to determine whether or not the significant financial interest constitutes a financial conflict of interest is whether or not the financial interest could directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of your research. This is a definition, like almost all of these, directly from the regulations. While it does provide some guidance, it does not specify what we mean by directly affecting the research or significantly affecting the research. That will be up to the institution, the university, to make those determinations. The next step is for those significant financial interests that are determined to be financial conflicts of interest to be managed. And by managed, we mean that we must provide, again, quoting from the regulations, a reasonable expectation that the research that you're conducting is free from bias due to the financial conflict of interest. And the way we'll do that is with a management plan. So let's look at a couple of examples of financial conflicts of interest and the management plans we would put in place. Let's say that you are a consultant paid by a pharmaceutical firm, and that firm markets a compound that's a subject of your NIH-sponsored research. The management plan that we would put in place would include disclosure. All management plans will include disclosure. By disclosure, we mean you will disclose the fact when you are presenting your research or publishing your research results that you have a financial conflict of interest. This is nothing new. Scientific journals virtually all require the disclosure of financial conflicts of interest of authors. Your research itself will probably include design elements intended to manage or reduce or eliminate bias in the research from all sorts of sources. If you're doing research on human subjects, for example, you as the researcher may be blinded to the treatments. The subjects themselves may be blinded to the treatments. That is a management tool that reduces bias in research, and we will highlight it as a management tool to reduce any bias that might come about as a result of your financial conflict of interest. And finally, we will require that you and your department chair, at least on an annual basis, review your financial conflict of interest in your research. Let's look at another example. Royalties that you receive from a license between the university and a company, and that company markets a compound that's the subject of your NIH research. What would the management plan be for that kind of a relationship? It's kind of a trick question. The licensing income, because it's coming through the university to you and not directly from the company, that would not count as a financial conflict of interest under these regulations. So there would be no need for a management plan. A third and final example would be the case where you own a part of a company that markets a compound that you're studying under an NIH-supported research grant. The management plan would include, of course, disclosure. Again, we would highlight the research design elements already in place to manage bias. You and your department chair would review your research and your financial conflict of interest annually, and your department chair or a designee would oversee your research and your publications to assure that the financial conflict of interest on your part doesn't bias the research. This oversight might be done by an individual or a committee with sufficient expertise to understand the research and the possible effects of the financial conflict of interest. The next step is for the university to report financial conflicts of interest and the fact that they've been managed and how they're going to be managed to the U.S. Public Health Service. We must do that before funds from the grant are expended. If the research is already ongoing and you discover a new or develop a new financial conflict of interest within 60 days of identifying it, and every year when the grant is renewed. Now, all of these are reporting actions that need to be taken with respect to each PHS-sponsored project. Service. For the principal investigator or project director and all folks who are listed as key personnel on the projects, their financial conflicts of interest and the associated management plans need to be posted on a publicly accessible web page. So that would be the university's web page that we would be posting those financial conflicts of interest on. How are we going to do all of this? Well, we're putting in place a number of procedures. And I'm going to quickly go through these procedures, and they are pretty much a recap of what's required by the regulations. That is what I've just described. We'll start with training. That training has already been taking place in in-person training sessions. This is an online session that will fulfill the training requirement. The next step is for the significant financial interests that you have under these regulations to be disclosed. We also need to know whether you have no significant financial interest. That'll be done when you submit a new proposal. It'll be done for existing proposals as the significant financial interest changes or if a new one develops, and it'll be done annually. And we'll do it through two mechanisms, at least initially. The first will be via email, and I'll be talking in a few minutes about the elements required in the email. That is, you will send an email to the Research Integrity Office which will describe your significant financial interests or your lack of any significant financial interest. The university is developing a conflict of interest information technology management system for disclosing your significant financial interests as well. That'll be a second way of doing these disclosures. That online system will serve as a single source for all conflict of interest disclosure, financial disclosure questions that you will be asked eventually. That is, the Institutional Review Board in reviewing human subjects research will use this system. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee will use it. The university's Conflict of Interest Office itself will use the system for State of Maryland Conflict of Interest review. Offices of Continuing Education in the various schools will use it as well. So there will be just one place to disclose these financial interests, and all of the various offices that need to review them will have access. A determination of financial conflict of interest will be made. That'll be done by our office, the Research Integrity Office, in consultation with you and your department chair. Likewise, the development of a management plan that will be recorded. And finally, the reporting to the U.S. Public Health Service will be done by us, by the Research Integrity Office, via a federal online information management system. What if the university doesn't do all of these things, and they don't do them in the time required by the federal regulations? There is some measure of penalty that will be involved for noncompliance with these regulations, and these penalties are prescribed by the regulations. Let's say that you as an investigator fail to receive training. That's not going to happen to you because you're viewing this presentation, and that is your training. But if an investigator does fail to have training, really the only penalty is you'll have to go through the training before the research can begin. So there could be a delay in the research. Let's say an investigator fails to disclose their significant financial interest. The penalty would be determined primarily on the reason for failing to disclose the significant financial interest. For example, if the investigator did not know about a significant financial interest, then likely there would be no penalty involved. However, if the investigator knew that they had a financial interest, but didn't know that they were supposed to disclose it to the university as a significant financial interest. The penalty really would be that you'd have to repeat the training so that you know that any significant financial interest you have under these regulations must be disclosed. Now let's say that there's a failure to report a financial conflict of interest to the PHS. Remember, that responsibility lies with the university. So it's the university's failure to report the financial conflict of interest. The PHS agency supporting your research may decide to withdraw or disallow funding for that project, partially or completely. But the most important piece of this is that whenever that happens, whenever there's a failure to report a financial conflict of interest and a management plan, the university is required to review the research that's been conducted during the time that there was the significant financial interest that was not managed and not reported, and make a determination as to whether the research was biased as a result of the financial conflict of interest. And that report needs to go to the U.S. Public Health Service. If you did not report a significant financial interest, and that was the reason that a financial conflict of interest was never reported, then personnel actions, disciplinary actions may be taken against that investigator by the university. An investigator's failure to comply with a management plan that's been established likewise would likely result in disciplinary action from the university. Let's look now at a flow chart of these procedures, starting with, in the upper left-hand corner, the investigator's disclosure of a significant financial interest. Those disclosures will be made to the Research Integrity Office via either email or a conflict of interest online module that's in development. The email will go to an address at our office and will include a number of elements, such as the name of the entity that you have the significant financial interest with, the nature of the significant financial interest, the amount, the dates, and a brief description. The Research Integrity Office will take that information, determine whether it needs more information or not. If we need more information, you will be the person that we contact to get the additional information. And we'll also take a look at your PHS-sponsored research. And with you and your department chair, we'll make a final determination as to whether or not any of the significant financial interests that you've disclosed constitute financial conflicts of interest. If they do not, then that determination will be recorded and will be maintained in a database showing that you do not have any financial conflicts of interest with your NIH research. If it is determined that there's a financial conflict of interest, a management plan will be developed with you and with your department chair to reduce or eliminate bias in the research, and the reporting will be done by the university. That is, the PHS will be informed that you have a financial conflict of interest and how that financial conflict of interest is being managed. We are available in the Research Integrity Office to answer any questions that you may have. There are two of us who are working on this, my colleague Allison Watkins and myself, Joe Giffels. These are our email addresses, and we do have a website as well that has plenty of information. Thank you for your attention.